That's right. It's his name's on that land, nobody
Yeah,
else's.
that's true.
And it's his. And he's given it to Abraham. He confirmed it again to Isaac. He confirmed it to Jacob. It was by a perpetual decree that had nothing to do with Israel's obedience. It was unconditional. This
Yes.
land is yours. And the spiritual attack on that promise has been since the very beginning. And it's amazing too, Gary, when you look at the land he actually prophesied and promised to them, they're occupying the smallest sliver of it possible. The land goes from the river Euphrates through Iraq all the way to the river Nile in Egypt. That's their land. And he promised that to Abraham. And so it'll be amazing to see how all these wars and battles unfold, how much of the land they start to get more of, maybe in our lifetime. Who knows?
Well,
But certainly
actually,
when Jesus rules and reigns.
I would hazard that it's happening right now. I mean, I don't want to set dates or anything, and I don't do that, but I'm looking at what's happening right now. And from Russia all the way down into Northeast Africa, all the way across to Turkey. And Turkey, is where the 7 churches were located. And you take all that biblical land, and it is as hot can be right now. There is plotting, there is planning, there is global maneuvering of all sorts. And for some reason, God put a lot of oil in that country. I understand that the oil reserves in the Middle East and under the Mediterranean Sea are the largest oil reserves in the whole wide world. And so there's another reason to fight over God's country.
That's right. And they just discovered that right off the coast of Israel. They found this huge gas and oil reserve that's been there forever. They just discovered it. And that could be the reason why in the Gog and Magog war, Russia comes down to seek booty or wealth,
Yes.
to steal Israel's wealth. They may become a very wealthy nation after all, which they haven't been for decades.
I got to ask you a question. You preach to a Bible-believing group, people who are hanging on the Word of God and just loving to hear about it. And when you talked about Zechariah over your recent study, what was their reaction? What came out of their participation?
Yes, I'll answer that this way, I think. When you go to Revelation 19, God declares the testimony of Jesus is the spirit of prophecy. And we, like at our church at New City, like you guys, Gary, we're prophecy watchers. We are watching. And when you line up Zechariah, because everything prophetic in the Word of God speaks of Jesus somehow, it's the testimony of Jesus some way. You just have to find how does it point to him. And in Zechariah, God speaks of Jesus in a lot of ways. He speaks of him as the stone with 7 eyes, which is a link to Revelation. He speaks of his throne, Jesus' throne. He speaks of Jesus the Nazarene, which was a prophecy you don't find anywhere else. He prophesies the king riding on a donkey in Zechariah 9:9, the Messiah coming forth, and he fulfilled that certainly to the day according to Daniel 9 and the 70 weeks of Daniel when he would ride in on that donkey.
Yes.
So he's going to ride in on a donkey, but Daniel 9 tells you when will he ride in on the donkey. And when you study the life of Jesus, he always slipped away when they tried to grab him and saying things like, "My time's not yet. My time's not yet. It's not my time yet." And then one day he orchestrated it to fulfill Zechariah 9:9 on the day that Daniel 9 prophesied. And that's amazing.
That's a lot of nines.
It is a lot of nines, yeah. And Zechariah describes him as the shepherd, his betrayal for 30 pieces of silver, actually, and what they did with the money to buy a field. Remember when he's betrayed in the New Testament for 30 pieces of silver, and silver in the Bible always speaks of blood, Levitically, and that's why the tabernacle is carried on the poles with the silver sockets, because our relationship with Jesus stands on the blood of
Could
Christ.
I read Zechariah 9:9?
Yeah.
Since we're talking about this. "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, O daughter of Jerusalem. Behold, thy king cometh unto thee. He is just, having salvation, lowly, riding upon an ass, and upon a colt, the foal of an ass. Now, how about that for a compact statement?
One verse.
Amazing. That was one verse. It's a whole story. It's a whole Bible. And there it is in Zechariah 9:9.
And not just that it would be their king, but what he would ride on.
Yeah.
The fact in the New Testament that it was never ridden on before, which if you've ever tried to ride on a wild animal that's never been set on, they don't cooperate. But Jesus made it cooperate.
Oh, of course.
And come down. And then that he would be pierced or crucified. Crucifixion in Zechariah's day wasn't even invented yet. And yet there it is, that they shall look upon him whom they have pierced.
Yeah.
When he returns the second time. And that, of course, his ruling and reigning and the destruction at Armageddon, how he just, when you read Zechariah at the end in chapter 14, when their eyes melt in their eye sockets and all this tissue melts away at Armageddon, and Jesus comes back, and we know, Gary, from Colossians chapter 1, that by him all things consist. And in the Greek, that means are held together.
Literally held together. Yeah.
And, you know, as a guy that's an engineer and I love science, I think the Bible is the greatest science book ever written. I'll never forget this. A few years ago, scientists have been looking in quantum physics for decades in terms of what holds an atom together. Because you have a nucleus in the center of the atom, and you have all these electrons and protons spinning around it. Well, they're like charges. They're negative and positively charged. And if you take the ends of two magnets that are south poles, they repel. So what is holding those atoms together? Because you have all these like charges close to one another, they should be ripping apart. And when you can break that bond, we've discovered it's the greatest source of energy in man's history, the nuclear bomb. But what holds it together? Well, I think it was around 2018, maybe 2019, there was an article published. They'd been calling it gluons forever. You know, they're gluons.
Yeah, what a fancy name.
They just made something up because they didn't know what it was.
A sticky something called a gluon.
And they finally discovered about 5 years ago that it's sound waves. Sound waves are what's holding every single atom together. Well, that's what the Bible has said all along. By him, all things consist or are held together. And we know in Genesis 1 that Jesus spoke everything into existence. So by the word of his mouth, all things are held together. And he's holding them together right now. Imagine the creator of the universe holding even his enemies together right now. Well, in Zechariah 14, when he returns, we learn that's how he wipes them out, by the word of his mouth, the sword of the Spirit. And he just lets them go. And that atomic structure just falls apart. It's not even a battle, really. You know, in Christian circles, we always call it the Battle of Armageddon. There's really no battle. It's a staging ground.
Yes.
And Jesus comes back, and there is no contest. He just wipes them out.